of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 78. At last Monday came, and Philip thought his long torture was over. Looking out the trains, he found that the latest by which Griffiths could reach home that night left Oxford soon after 1, and he supposed that Mildred would take one which started a few minutes later to bring her to London. His desire was to go and meet it, but he thought Mildred would like to be left alone for a day. Perhaps she would drop him a line in the evening to say she was back, and if not he would call at her lodgings next morning. His spirit was cowed. He felt a bitter hatred for Griffiths, but for Mildred, notwithstanding all that had passed, only a heart-rending desire. He was glad now that Hayward was not in London on Saturday afternoon, when, distraught, he went in search of human comfort. He could not have prevented himself from telling him everything, and Hayward would have been astonished at his weakness. He would despise him, and perhaps be shocked or disgusted that he could envisage the possibility of making Mildred his mistress after she had given herself to another man. What did he care if it was shocking or disgusting? He was ready for any compromise, prepared for more degrading humiliation still, if he could only gratify his desire. Towards the evening his steps took him against his will to the house in which she lived, and he looked up at her window. It was dark. He did not venture to ask if she was back. He was confident in her promise. But there was no letter from her in the morning, and when about midday he called, the maid told him she had not arrived. He could not understand it. He knew that Griffiths would have been obliged to go home the day before, for he was to be the best man at a wedding, and Mildred had no money. He turned over in his mind every possible thing that might have happened. He went again in the afternoon and left a note, asking her to dine with him that evening as calmly as though the events of the last fortnight had not happened. He mentioned the place and time at which they were to meet, and hoping against hope, kept the appointment. Though he waited for an hour, she did not come. On Wednesday morning he was ashamed to ask at the house, and sent a messenger boy with a letter and instructions to bring back a reply. But in an hour the boy came back with Philip's letter unopened, and the answer that the lady had not returned from the country. Philip was beside himself. The last deception was more than he could bear. He repeated to himself over and over again that he loathed Mildred, and ascribing to Griffiths this new disappointment, he hated him so much that he knew what was the delight of murder. He walked about considering what a joy it would be to come upon him on a dark night and stick a knife into his throat, just about the carotid artery, and leave him to die in the street like a dog. Philip was out of his senses with grief and rage. He did not like whiskey, but he drank to stupefy himself. He went to bed drunk on the Tuesday and on the Wednesday night. On Thursday morning he got up very late and dragged himself, blear-eyed and sallow, into his sitting room to see if there were any letters. A curious feeling shot through his heart when he recognized the handwriting of Griffiths. Dear old man, I hardly know how to write to you, and yet I feel I must write. I hope you're not awfully angry with me. I know I oughtn't to have gone away with Milly, but I simply couldn't help myself. She simply carried me off my feet, and I would have done anything to get her. When she told me you had offered us the money to go, I simply couldn't resist. And now it's all over I'm awfully ashamed of myself, and I wish I hadn't been such a fool. I wish you'd write and say you're not angry with me, and I want you to let me come and see you. I was awfully hurt at your telling Milly you didn't want to see me. Do write me a line, there's a good chap, and tell me you forgive me. It'll ease my conscience. I thought you wouldn't mind, or you wouldn't have offered the money, but I know I oughtn't to have taken it. I came home on Monday, and Milly wanted to stay a couple of days at Oxford by herself. She's going back to London on Wednesday, so by the time you receive this letter you will have seen her, and I hope everything will go off all right. Do write and say you forgive me. Please write at once. Yours ever, Harry. Philip tore the letter up furiously. He did not mean to answer it. He despised Griffiths for his apologies, he had no patience with his prickings of conscience. One could do a dastardly thing if one chose, but it was contemptible to regret it afterwards. He thought the letter cowardly and hypocritical. He was disgusted at its sentimentality. "It would be very easy if you could do a beastly thing," he muttered to himself, "and then say you were sorry, and that put it all right again." He hoped with all his heart he would have the chance one day to do Griffiths a bad turn. But at all events he knew that Mildred was in town. He dressed hurriedly, not waiting to shave, drank a cup of tea, and took a cab to her rooms. The cab seemed to crawl. He was painfully anxious to see her, and unconsciously he uttered a prayer to the God he did not believe in to make her receive him kindly. He only wanted to forget. With beating heart he rang the bell. He forgot all his suffering in the passionate desire to enfold her once more in his arms. "Is Mrs. Miller in?" he asked joyously. "She's gone," the maid answered. He looked at her blankly. "She came about an hour ago and took away her things." For a moment he did not know what to say. "Did you give her my letter? Did she say where she was going?" Then he understood that Mildred had deceived him again. She was not coming back to him. He made an effort to save his face. "Oh, well, I daresay I shall hear from her. She may have sent a letter to another address." He turned away and went back hopeless to his rooms. He might have known that she would do this. She had never cared for him, she had made a fool of him from the beginning. She had no pity, she had no kindness, she had no charity. The only thing was to accept the inevitable. The pain he was suffering was horrible. He would sooner be dead than endure it, and the thought came to him that it would be better to finish with the whole thing. He might throw himself in the river or put his neck on a railway line. But he had no sooner set the thought into words than he rebelled against it. His reason told him that he would get over his unhappiness in time. If he tried with all his might, he could forget her, and it would be grotesque to kill himself on account of a vulgar slut. He had only one life, and it was madness to fling it away. He felt that he would never overcome his passion, but he knew that after all it was only a matter of time. He would not stay in London. There everything reminded him of his unhappiness. He telegraphed to his uncle that he was coming to Blackstable, and hurrying to pack, took the first train he could. He wanted to get away from the sordid rooms in which he had endured so much suffering. He wanted to breathe clean air. He was disgusted with himself. He felt that he was a little mad. Since he was grown up, Philip had been given the best spare room at the vicarage. It was a corner room, and in front of one window was an old tree which blocked the view, but from the other you saw, beyond the garden and the vicarage field, broad meadows. Philip remembered the wall-paper from his earliest years. On the walls were quaint water-colours of the early Victorian period by a friend of the vicar's youth. They had a faded charm. The dressing-table was surrounded by stiff muslin. There was an old tall boy to put your clothes in. Philip gave a sigh of pleasure. He had never realised that all those things meant anything to him at all. At the vicarage life went on as it had always done. No piece of furniture had been moved from one place to another. The vicar ate the same things, said the same things, went for the same walk every day. He had grown a little fatter, a little more silent, a little more narrow. He had become accustomed to living without his wife, and missed her very little. He bickered still with Josiah Graves. Philip went to see the churchwarden. He was a little thinner, a little whiter, a little more austere. He was autocratic still, and still disapproved of candles on the altar. The shops had still a pleasant quaintness, and Philip stood in front of that in which things useful to seamen were sold, sea boots and tarpaulins and tackle, and remembered that he had felt there in his childhood the thrill of the sea and the adventurous magic of the unknown. He could not help his heart beating at each double knock of the postman in case there might be a letter from Mildred sent on by his landlady in London, but he knew that there would be none. Now that he could think it out more calmly, he understood that in trying to force Mildred to love him he had been attempting the impossible. He did not know what it was that passed from a man to a woman, from a woman to a man, and made one of them a slave. It was convenient to call it the sexual instinct, but if it was no more than that, he did not understand why it should occasion so vehement an attraction to one person rather than another. It was irresistible. The mind could not battle with it. Friendship, gratitude, interest had no power beside it. Because he had not attracted Mildred sexually, nothing that he did had any effect upon her. The idea revolted him. It made human nature beastly, and he felt suddenly that the hearts of men were full of dark places. Because Mildred was indifferent to him, he had thought her sexless. Her anemic appearance and thin lips, the body with its narrow hips and flat chest, the languor of her manner carried out his supposition, and yet she was capable of sudden passions which made her willing to risk everything to gratify them. He had never understood her adventure with Emil Miller. It had seemed so unlike her, and she had never been able to explain it. But now that he had seen her with Griffiths, he knew that just the same thing had happened then. She had been carried off her feet by an ungovernable desire. He tried to think out what those two men had which so strangely attracted her. They both had a vulgar facetiousness which tickled her simple sense of humour, and a certain coarseness of nature. But what took her perhaps was the blatant sexuality which was their most marked characteristic. She had a genteel refinement which shuddered at the facts of life. She looked upon the bodily functions as indecent. She had all sorts of euphemisms for common objects. She always chose an elaborate word as more becoming than a simple one. The brutality of these men was like a whip on her thin white shoulders, and she shuddered with voluptuous pain. One thing Philip had made up his mind about. He would not go back to the lodging in which he had suffered. He wrote to his landlady and gave her notice. He wanted to have his own things about him. He determined to take unfurnished rooms. It would be pleasant and cheaper, and this was an urgent consideration, for during the last year and a half he had spent nearly £700. He must make up for it now by the most rigid economy. Now and then he thought of the future with panic. He had been a fool to spend so much money on Mildred, but he knew that if it were to come again, he would act in the same way. It amused him sometimes to consider that his friends, because he had a face which did not express his feelings very vividly and a rather slow way of moving, looked upon him as strong-minded, deliberate, and cool. They thought him reasonable and praised his common sense. But he knew that his placid expression was no more than a mask, assumed unconsciously, which acted like the protective colouring of butterflies, and himself was astonished at the weakness of his will. It seemed to him that he was swayed by every light emotion, as though he were a leaf in the wind, and when passion seized him he was powerless. He had no self-control. He merely seemed to possess it because he was indifferent to many of the things which moved other people. He considered with some irony the philosophy which he had developed for himself, for it had not been of much use to him in the conjuncture he had passed through, and he wondered whether thought really helped a man in any of the critical affairs of life. It seemed to him rather that he was swayed by some power alien to and yet within himself, which urged him like the great wind of hell which drove Paolo and Francesca ceaselessly on. He thought of what he was going to do and, when the time came to act, he was powerless in the grasp of instincts, emotions, he knew not what. He acted as though he were a machine driven by the two forces of his environment and his personality. His reason was someone looking on, observing the facts, but powerless to interfere. It was like those gods of Epicurus, who saw the doings of men from their empyrean heights and had no might to alter one smallest particle of what occurred. Chapter 79. Philip went up to London a couple of days before the session began in order to find himself rooms. He hunted about the streets that led out of the Westminster Bridge Road, but their dinginess was distasteful to him; and at last he found one in Kennington which had a quiet and old world air. It reminded one a little of the London which Thackeray knew on that side of the river, and in the Kennington Road, through which the great barouche of the Newcomes must have passed as it drove the family to the west of London, the plane trees were bursting into leaf. The houses in the street which Philip fixed upon were two-storied, and in most of the windows was a notice to state that lodgings were to let. He knocked at one which announced that lodgings were unfurnished, and was shown by an austere, silent woman 4 very small rooms, in one of which there was a kitchen range and a sink. The rent was 9 shillings a week. Philip did not want so many rooms, but the rent was low, and he wished to settle down at once. He asked the landlady if she could keep the place clean for him and cook his breakfast, but she replied that she had enough work to do without that; and he was pleased rather than otherwise because she intimated that she wished to have nothing more to do with him than to receive his rent. She told him that if he inquired at the grocer's round the corner, which was also a post office, she might hear of a woman who would do for him. Philip had a little furniture which he had gathered as he went along, an arm-chair that he bought in Paris, and a table, a few drawings, and the small Persian rug which Cronshaw had given him. His uncle had offered a fold-up bed for which, now that he no longer let his house in August, he had no further use, and by spending another £10 Philip bought himself whatever else was essential. He spent 10 shillings on putting a corn-coloured paper in the room he was making his parlour, and he hung on the walls a sketch which Lawson had given him of the Quai des Grands Augustins, and the photograph of the Odalisque by Ingres, and Manet's Olympia, which in Paris had been the objects of his contemplation while he shaved. To remind himself that he too had once been engaged in the practice of art, he put up a charcoal drawing of the young Spaniard Miguel Ahura. It was the best thing he had ever done, a nude standing with clenched fists, his feet gripping the floor with peculiar force, and on his face that air of determination which had been so impressive. And though Philip, after the long interval, saw very well the defects of his work, its associations made him look upon it with tolerance. He wondered what had happened to Miguel. There is nothing so terrible as the pursuit of art by those who have no talent. Perhaps, worn out by exposure, starvation, disease, he had found an end in some hospital, or in an access of despair had sought death in the turbid Seine. But perhaps with his southern instability he had given up the struggle of his own accord, and now, a clerk in some office in Madrid, turned his fervent rhetoric to politics and bullfighting. Philip asked Lawson and Hayward to come and see his new rooms, and they came, one with a bottle of whiskey, the other with a pâté de foie gras, and he was delighted when they praised his taste. He would have invited the Scotch stockbroker too, but he had only 3 chairs, and thus could entertain only a definite number of guests. Lawson was aware that through him Philip had become very friendly with Norah Nesbit, and now remarked that he had run across her a few days before. She was asking how you were. Philip flushed at the mention of her name. He could not get himself out of the awkward habit of reddening when he was embarrassed, and Lawson looked at him quizzically. Lawson, who now spent most of the year in London, had so far surrendered to his environment as to wear his hair short and to dress himself in a neat serge suit and a bowler hat. "I gather that all is over between you," he said. "I've not seen her for months." "She was looking rather nice. She had a very smart hat on with a lot of white ostrich feathers on it. She must be doing pretty well." Philip changed the conversation, but he kept thinking of her, and after an interval, when the 3 of them were talking of something else, he asked suddenly, "Did you gather that Norah was angry with me?" "Not a bit. She talked very nicely of you." "I've got half a mind to go and see her." "She won't eat you." Philip had thought of Norah often. When Mildred left him his first thought was of her, and he told himself bitterly that she would never have treated him so. His impulse was to go to her. He could depend on her pity. But he was ashamed. She had been good to him always, and he had treated her abominably. "If I'd only had the sense to stick to her," he said to himself afterwards when Lawson and Hayward had gone, and he was smoking a last pipe before going to bed. He remembered the pleasant hours they had spent together in the cosy sitting room in Vincent Square, their visits to galleries and to the play, and the charming evenings of intimate conversation. He recollected her solicitude for his welfare and her interest in all that concerned him. She had loved him with a love that was kind and lasting. There was more than sensuality in that. It was almost maternal. He had always known that it was a precious thing for which with all his soul he should thank the gods. He made up his mind to throw himself on her mercy. She must have suffered horribly, but he felt she had the greatness of heart to forgive him. She was incapable of malice. Should he write to her? No. He would break in on her suddenly and cast himself at her feet. He knew that when the time came he would feel too shy to perform such a dramatic gesture, but that was how he liked to think of it, and tell her that if she would take him back she might rely on him for ever. He was cured of the hateful disease from which he had suffered. He knew her worth, and now she might trust him. His imagination leaped forward to the future. He pictured himself rowing with her on the river on Sundays. He would take her to Greenwich. He had never forgotten that delightful excursion with Hayward, and the beauty of the port of London remained a permanent treasure in his recollection. And on the warm summer afternoons they would sit in the park together and talk. He laughed to himself as he remembered her gay chatter, which poured out like a brook bubbling over little stones, amusing, flippant, and full of character. The agony he had suffered would pass from his mind like a bad dream. But when next day, about tea time, an hour at which he was pretty certain to find Norah at home, he knocked at her door, his courage suddenly failed him. Was it possible for her to forgive him? It would be abominable of him to force himself on her presence. The door was opened by a maid, new since he had been in the habit of calling every day, and he inquired if Mrs. Nesbit was in. "Would you ask her if she could see Mr. Carey?" he said. "I'll wait here." The maid ran upstairs and in a moment clattered down again. "Will you step up, please, sir? Second floor front." "I know," said Philip, with a slight smile. He went with a fluttering heart. He knocked at the door. "Come in," said the well-known, cheerful voice. It seemed to say, "Come into a new life of peace and happiness." When he entered, Norah stepped forward to greet him. She shook hands with him as if they had parted the day before. A man stood up. "Mr. Carey? Mr. Kingsford." Philip, bitterly disappointed at not finding her alone, sat down and took stock of the stranger. He had never heard her mention his name, but he seemed to Philip to occupy a chair as though he were very much at home. He was a man of 40, clean-shaven, with long fair hair very neatly plastered down, and the reddish skin and pale, tired eyes which fair men get when their youth is past. He had a large nose, a large mouth. The bones of his face were prominent, and he was heavily made. He was a man of more than average height, and broad-shouldered. "I was wondering what had become of you," said Norah in her sprightly manner. "I met Mr. Lawson the other day, did he tell you? And I informed him that it was really high time you came to see me again." Philip could see no shadow of embarrassment in her countenance, and he admired the use with which she carried off an encounter of which himself felt the intense awkwardness. She gave him tea. She was about to put sugar in it when he stopped her. "How stupid of me!" she cried. "I forgot." He did not believe that. She must remember quite well that he never took sugar in his tea. He accepted the incident as a sign that her nonchalance was effective. The conversation which Philip had interrupted went on, and presently he began to feel a little in the way. Kingsford took no particular notice of him. He talked fluently and well, not without humour, but with a slightly dogmatic manner. He was a journalist, it appeared, and had something amusing to say on every topic that was touched upon. But it exasperated Philip to find himself edged out of the conversation. He was determined to stay the visitor out. He wondered if he admired Norah. In the old days they had often talked of the men who wanted to flirt with her and laughed at them together. Philip tried to bring back the conversation to matters which only he and Norah knew about, but each time the journalist broke in and succeeded in drawing it away to a subject upon which Philip was forced to be silent. He grew faintly angry with Norah, for she must see he was being made ridiculous, but perhaps she was inflicting this upon him as a punishment, and with this thought he regained his good humour. At last, however, the clock struck 6, and Kingsford got up. "I must go," he said. Norah shook hands with him and accompanied him to the landing. She shut the door behind her and stood outside for a couple of minutes. Philip wondered what they were talking about. "Who is Mr. Kingsford?" he asked cheerfully when she returned. "Oh, he's the editor of one of the Harmsworth magazines. He's been taking a good deal of my work lately." "I thought he was never going." "I'm glad you stayed. I wanted to have a talk with you." She curled up into the large arm-chair, feet and all, in a way her small size made possible, and lit a cigarette. She smiled when he saw her assume the attitude which had always amused him. "You look just like a cat." She gave him a flash of her dark, fine eyes. "I really ought to break myself of the habit. It's absurd to behave like a child when you're my age, but I'm comfortable with my legs under me." "It's awfully jolly to be sitting in this room again," said Philip happily. "You don't know how I've missed it." "Why on earth didn't you come before?" she asked gaily. "I was afraid to," he said, reddening. She gave him a look of kindness. Her lips outlined a charming smile. "You needn't have been." He hesitated for a moment. His heart beat quickly. "Do you remember the last time we met? I treated you awfully badly. I'm dreadfully ashamed of myself." She looked at him steadily. She did not answer. He was losing his head. He seemed to have come on an errand of which he was only now realizing the outrageousness. She did not help him, and he could only blurt out bluntly, "Can you ever forgive me?" Then impetuously he told her that Mildred had left him, and that his unhappiness had been so great that he almost killed himself. He told her of all that had happened between them, of the birth of the child, and of the meeting with Griffiths, of his folly and his trust and his immense deception. He told her how often he had thought of her kindness and of her love, and how bitterly he had regretted throwing it away. He had only been happy when he was with her, and he knew now how great was her worth. His voice was hoarse with emotion. Sometimes he was so ashamed of what he was saying that he spoke with his eyes fixed on the ground. His face was distorted with pain, and yet he felt it a strange relief to speak. At last he finished. He flung himself back in his chair, exhausted, and waited. He had concealed nothing, and even in his self-abasement he had striven to make himself more despicable than he had really been. He was surprised that she did not speak, and at last he raised his eyes. She was not looking at him. Her face was quite white, and she seemed to be lost in thought. "Haven't you got anything to say to me?" She started and reddened. "I'm afraid you've had a rotten time," she said. "I'm dreadfully sorry." She seemed about to go on, but she stopped, and again he waited. At length she seemed to force herself to speak. "I'm engaged to be married to Mr. Kingsford." "Why didn't you tell me at once?" he cried. "You needn't have allowed me to humiliate myself before you." "I'm sorry I couldn't stop you. I met him soon after you." She seemed to search for an expression that she should not wound him. "Told me your friend had come back. I was very wretched for a bit. He was extremely kind to me. He knew someone had made me suffer. Of course he doesn't know it was you, and I don't know what I should have done without him. And suddenly I felt I couldn't go on working. I was so tired, I felt so ill. I told him about my husband. He offered to give me the money to get my divorce if I would marry him as soon as I could. He had a very good job, and it wouldn't be necessary for me to do anything unless I wanted to. He was so fond of me, and so anxious to take care of me.
I was awfully touched, and now I'm very, very fond of him."
"Have you got your divorce, then?" asked Philip.
"I've got the degree nisi. It'll be made absolute in July, and then we are going to be married at once."
For some time Philip did not say anything. "I wish I hadn't made such a fool of myself," he muttered at length. He was thinking of his long, humiliating confession. She looked at him curiously.
"You were never really in love with me," she said.
"It's not very pleasant being in love." But he was always able to recover himself quickly, and getting up now and holding out his hand, he said: "I hope you'll be very happy. After all, it's the best thing that could have happened to you." She looked a little wistfully at him as she took his hand and held it.
"You'll come and see me again, won't you?" she asked.
"No," he said, shaking his head. "It would make me too envious to see you happy." He walked slowly away from her house. After all, she was right when she said he had never loved her. He was disappointed, irritated even, but his vanity was more affected than his heart. He knew that himself. And presently he grew conscious that the gods had played a very good practical joke on him, and he laughed at himself mirthlessly. It is not very comfortable to have the gift of being amused at one's own absurdity. Chapter 80. For the next 3 months Philip worked on subjects which were new to him. The unwieldy crowd which had entered the medical school nearly 2 years before had thinned out. Some had left the hospital, finding the examinations more difficult to pass than they expected. Some had been taken away by parents who had not foreseen the expense of life in London, and some had drifted away to other callings. One youth who Philip knew had devised an ingenious plan to make money. He had bought things at sales and pawned them, but presently found it more profitable to pawn goods bought on credit, and it had caused a little excitement at the hospital when someone pointed out his name in police court proceedings. There had been a remand, then assurances on the part of a harassed father, and the young man had gone out to bear the white man's burden overseas. The imagination of another, a lad who had never before been in a town at all, fell to the glamour of music halls and bar parlours. He spent his time among racing men, tipsters, and trainers, and now was become a bookmaker's clerk. Philip had seen him once in a bar near Piccadilly Circus, in a tight-waisted coat and a brown hat with a broad, flat brim. A third, with a gift for singing and mimicry, who had achieved success at the smoking concerts of the medical school by his imitation of notorious comedians, had abandoned the hospital for the chorus of a musical comedy. Still another, and he interested Philip because his uncouth manner and interjectional speech did not suggest that he was capable of any deep emotion, had felt himself stifled among the houses of London. He grew haggard in shut-in spaces, and the soul he knew not he possessed struggled like a sparrow held in the hand, with little frightened gasps and a quick palpitation of the heart. He yearned for the broad skies and the open desolate places among which his childhood had been spent. And he walked off one day, without a word to anybody, between one lecture and another, and the next thing his friends heard was that he had thrown up medicine and was working on a farm. Philip attended now lectures on medicine and on surgery. On certain mornings in the week he practised bandaging on out-patients glad to earn a little money, and he was taught auscultation and how to use the stethoscope. He learned dispensing. He was taking the examination in materia medica in July, and it amused him to play with various drugs, concocting mixtures, rolling pills, and making ointments. He seized avidly upon anything from which he could extract a suggestion of human interest. He saw Griffiths once in the distance, but, not to have the pain of cutting him dead, avoided him. Philip had felt a certain self-consciousness with Griffiths' friends, some of whom were now friends of his, when he realised they knew of his quarrel with Griffiths and surmised they were aware of the reason. One of them, a very tall fellow with a small head and a languid air, a fellow called Ramsden, who was one of Griffiths' most faithful admirers, copied his ties, his boots, his manner of talking and his gestures, told Philip that Griffiths was very much hurt because Philip had not answered his letter. He wanted to be reconciled with him. "Has he asked you to give me the message?" asked Philip. "Oh, no, I'm saying this entirely on my own," said Ramsden. "He's awfully sorry for what he did, and he says you always behaved like a perfect brick to him. I know he'll be glad to make it up. He doesn't come to the hospital because he's afraid of meeting you, and he thinks you'd cut him." "I should." "It makes him feel rather wretched, you know." "I can bear the trifling inconvenience that he feels with a good deal of fortitude," said Philip. "He'll do anything he can to make it up." "How childish and hysterical! Why should he care? I'm a very insignificant person, and he can do very well without my company. I'm not interested in him any more." Ramsden thought Philip hard and cold. He paused for a moment or two, looking about him in a perplexed way. "Harry wishes to God he'd never had anything to do with the woman." "Does he?" asked Philip. He spoke with an indifference which he was satisfied with. No one could have guessed how violently his heart was beating. He waited impatiently for Ramsden to go on. "I suppose you've quite got over it now, haven't you?" "I?" said Philip. "Quite." Little by little he discovered the history of Mildred's relations with Griffiths. He listened with a smile on his lips, feigning an equanimity which quite deceived the dull-witted boy who talked to him. The week end she spent with Griffiths at Oxford inflamed rather than extinguished her sudden passion, and when Griffiths went home, with a feeling that was unexpected in her, she determined to stay in Oxford by herself for a couple of days, because she had been so happy in it. She felt that nothing could induce her to go back to Philip. He revolted her. Griffiths was taken aback at the fire he had aroused, for he had found his 2 days with her in the country somewhat tedious, and he had no desire to turn an amusing episode into a tiresome affair. She made him promise to write to her, and, being an honest, decent fellow, with natural politeness and a desire to make himself pleasant to everybody, when he got home he wrote her a long and charming letter. She answered it with reams of passion, clumsy, for she had no gift of expression, ill-written and vulgar. The letter bored him, and when it was followed next day by another, and the day after by a third, he began to think her love no longer flattering but alarming. He did not answer, and she bombarded him with telegrams, asking him if he were ill and had received her letters. She said his silence made her dreadfully anxious. He was forced to write, but he sought to make his reply as casual as was possible without being offensive. He begged her not to wire, since it was difficult to explain telegrams to his mother, an old-fashioned person for whom a telegram was still an event to excite tremor. She answered by return of post that she must see him, and announced her intention to pawn things. She had the dressing case which Philip had given her as a wedding present, and could raise £8 on that. In order to come up and stay at the market town 4 miles from which was the village in which his father practised. This frightened Griffiths, and he this time made use of the telegraph wires to tell her that she must do nothing of the kind. He promised to let her know the moment he came up to London, and when he did, found that she had already been asking for him at the hospital at which he had an appointment. He did not like this, and on now seeing her, told Mildred that she was not to come there on any pretext, and now, after an absence of 3 weeks, he found that she bored him quite decidedly. He wondered why he had ever troubled about her, and made up his mind to break with her as soon as he could. He was a person who dreaded quarrels, nor did he want to give pain, but at the same time he had other things to do, and he was quite determined not to let Mildred bother him. When he met her he was pleasant, cheerful, amusing, affectionate. He invented convincing excuses for the interval since last he had seen her, but he did everything he could to avoid her. When she forced him to make appointments, he sent telegrams to her at the last moment to put himself off, and his landlady, the first 3 months of his appointment he was spending in rooms, had orders to say he was out when Mildred called. She would waylay him in the street, and knowing she had been waiting about for him to come out of the hospital for a couple of hours, he would give her a few charming, friendly words, and bolt off with the excuse that he had a business engagement. He grew very skilful in slipping out of the hospital unseen. Once, when he went back to his lodgings at midnight, he saw a woman standing at the area railings, and suspecting who it was, went to beg a shakedown in Ramsden's rooms. Next day the landlady told him that Mildred had sat crying on the doorsteps for hours, and she had been obliged to tell her at last that if she did not go away she would send for a policeman. "I tell you, my boy," said Ramsden, "you're jolly well out of it. Harry says that if he'd suspected for half a second she was going to make such a blooming nuisance of herself, he'd have seen himself damned before he had anything to do with her." Philip thought of her sitting on that doorstep through the long hours of the night. He saw her face as she looked up dully at the landlady who sent her away. "I wonder what she's doing now." "Oh, she's got a job somewhere, thank God. That keeps her busy all day." The last thing he heard, just before the end of the summer session, was that Griffiths' urbanity had given way at length under the exasperation of the constant persecution. He had told Mildred that he was sick of being pestered, and she had better take herself off and not bother him again. It was the only thing he could do, said Ramsden. It was getting a bit too thick. "Is it all over then?" asked Philip. "Oh, he hasn't seen her for 10 days. You know, Harry's wonderful at dropping people. This is about the toughest nut he's ever had to crack, but he's cracked it all right." Then Philip heard nothing more of her at all. She vanished into the vast anonymous mass of the population of London. Chapter 80.